in 1741 in New York City, there were 10 fires over 3 short weeks. None of them were particularly devastating, but they were terrifying. I mean, New York's a small city in 1741. It's about a mile by a half a mile. If you think of Manhattan, the island of Manhattan, remember that only the very tip of Manhattan is settled at this time in New York's history. So jettison from your mind all thoughts of the New York that you most recently visited, and think of something much more akin to a colonial village. Think of Plymouth Plantation, if you can't think of anything else. A much smaller place, a very densely settled 18th century city. About 2,000 people live in New York in 1741. About 10,000 people live there. About 2,000 of them are slaves. So the highest, 1 in 5 New Yorkers are slaves in the 18th century, the highest percentage of slaves in any urban population north of Charleston, South Carolina. So when these fires erupt in March and April of 1741, the whites immediately turn their suspicion on the city's slaves and conclude pretty quickly that a vast slave conspiracy has been in the works, and that these fires are just the beginning of an attempt to kill all the whites and for slaves to liberate themselves. What happens subsequently in April and May is that some 200 African men, mainly a couple women, are rounded up. They're imprisoned in a dungeon in the basement of City Hall, and then those who don't confess are brought to trial before the Supreme Court. Those who are brought to trial are unfailingly found guilty, and they're either burned at the stake or hanged. Those who confess are sent to the Caribbean and sold into slavery there. So that's sort of the scope of the event, right? So this is something that happens. It's extraordinary in its magnitude and in the drama of the tale. It happens over a very short period of time. In terms of any kind of similar set of trials followed by grisly public executions in early American history, the next thing you would think of might be the Salem witchcraft trials in 1692. But in scale and in consequence, what happens in New York in 1741 is much bigger and more important, and yet much less well known. So for all kinds of reasons having to do with how interesting a story it is and how unknown the story is and how little known the history of slavery in New York is, I really wanted to write a book about this event, to try to ask people to sort of put it on the same page in their minds as Salem witchcraft, to think about early American history as populated by this event and its legacy as much as by this story of Salem. But I for years postponed any inquiry into this event because the sources are so, what I would call asymmetrical. That is to say, we know so much about the lawyers who tried these accused men, about the grand jurors who investigated the conspiracy, and especially about the 3 men who sat on the Supreme Court bench that tried these black men. And we know almost nothing about the black men themselves, these men and women who were enslaved in New York City. And from a historian's point of view, that is just hard to imagine writing a book from such a skewed set of evidence. So I struggled with this for years as I thought about, I really want to write this book. I just don't know how I would go about it. How would I compensate for this asymmetry of evidence? So what I want to do tonight is read to you a couple of passages to illustrate a couple of the strategies that I used to try to wrestle with that problem. And the book in a lot of ways is a meditation on the problem of this asymmetry of evidence. So let me just set up for you the first piece I'm going to read. The fires take place in March and April. And on April 21st, it just happens to be the regularly scheduled day when the Supreme Court's supposed to open its session, its spring session, to just review whatever cases have come to its attention. It's a quarterly meeting. And on that day, the Supreme Court decides to convene a grand jury to investigate the fires. So what I'm going to read to you is just the very beginning of that day, April 21st, 1741. Now remember, we're in a very small city, this densely settled, very small city of Manhattan. We're in a city that's gripped by panic. There have been these fires. There are many slaves have already been arrested. Many whites have fled to the suburbs in fear. England is at war with both France and with Spain, so there's all kinds of reasons to be worried about what's going on in the world if you're a New Yorker. And at this moment, the court convenes. But as I read, what I want you to listen for, and it won't be hard to listen for, is just how much I know about what happened in that courtroom that day. So the passage I'm going to read is sort of chock-a-block with detail, and I just want to call attention to that because it's actually meant to call attention to itself, the level of detail. At 9:30 on Tuesday, April 21st, 1741, the bell ringer, paid 9 pence for his pains, pulled the rope that rang the bell in the cupola atop a 2.5-story stone building on the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, to announce the sitting of the Supreme Court of the province of New York. The court, established in 1691, was only slightly older than the building, whose foundation was laid in 1699. It took 4 years, a herd of horses, and hundreds of men, slave and free, to build City Hall, out of stones that had once formed a barricade built by slaves generations before at Wall Street. In 1703, City Hall opened to house meetings of the Supreme Court, as well as the city's mayor and common council and the province's general assembly, although the assemblymen had cause for complaint. The assembly room on the east wing of the second floor wasn't furnished for another year. While politicians and lawyers argued in chambers, plumbers and plasterers trudged along the hallways, trailing their ladders behind them. And still the work continued. A cage, a whipping post, a pillory, and stocks were soon erected in front of the triple-arched arcade, opening onto Wall Street. In 1707, wainscot was nailed to the walls. 3 years later, seats for grand and petty jurymen were finally installed in the elegantly appointed Supreme Court room on the second floor. In 1711, masons working in the cellar's great jail, an open space that ran the length of the building, walled off corner cells. City Hall's bell and cupola, faced with a magnificent clock of 4 dials, topped the roof. At the sound of the bell on that Tuesday in April 1741, marking a half-hour warning, birds fluttered, scattering from their perches on the cupola, and flew over the city. And those officers of the court who had not already arrived entered through the Wall Street arcade, a gentle breeze at their backs, walked across the common hall, climbed the east wing stairs and under an arched entryway, and assembled in the Supreme Court room, where they were bathed in the early spring's slight morning light. Admitted by the doorkeeper, in came the clerk, the sheriff and his deputies, the crier, the bailiffs and constables. Spectators settled themselves on benches and on the balcony. In the dungeon below, thieves and alleged conspirators, Caesar, Prince, Cuffy, Peggy Carey, John and Sarah Hewson, and the more than 24 city slaves and so-called Spanish Negroes rounded up in the first weeks of April, listened to the peal of the bell and the clatter of footsteps. Last came the judges. Chief Justice James Delancey was noticeably absent. He'd been called to Providence to serve on a committee arbitrating a boundary dispute between Massachusetts and Rhode Island. In his absence, Second Justice Frederick Phillips officially headed the court, but Third Justice Daniel Horsmanden, with his English legal education, wielded overarching influence on the bench. The room hushed as the judges entered. Despite his penury, Horsmanden probably insisted on hiring a coach and six, a wild extravagance, to travel through town. Perhaps just such a coach stopped in front of City Hall that morning, its spry coachman opening the door and escorting the third justice down from the carriage and across the paving stones, past the cage, the whipping post, the pillory, the stocks. In New York, as one contemporary reported, judges and practicers in the Supreme and in all other courts wear no particular habits as they do at Westminster. But Daniel Horsmanden had made a splash in 1732 when he first arrived in New York and insisted on wearing his gown at court. According to a contemporary, Horsmanden's chief merit consisted in a gentlemanlike exterior, a strict attention to the formality and decorum of the court, and a defense of the profession against the vulgar and parsimonious prejudices of an uncultivated populace. On Tuesday, April 21st, as on every other day the Supreme Court sat in session, Daniel Horsmanden, with his gentlemanlike exterior, arrived at City Hall in a wig and robe finer than he could well afford. He was, at age 47, a decidedly portly man, whose rolling jowls were girdled by a stiff white collar just visible above his black robe. His wig, more gray than white, was parted at the middle and bulged out over his ears like two cottony rabbit tails. He had a high, wide forehead, a long, straight nose, thin, expressive brows, quick to arch, and a stare that was at once wounded and meant to intimidate. At 10 o'clock the bell tolled once more, and the crier called out, "Oyez! Our sovereign lord the king does strictly charge and command all manner of persons to keep silent upon pain of imprisonment." The second justice brought the court to order and began the process of impaneling a grand jury to investigate the fires. A year older than Horsmandan, Frederick Phillips looked younger. His almond-shaped eyes, half-lidded, peered out from a baby face, with flushed cheeks and full lips. Phillips cleared his throat and handed a writ to the sheriff. "We command that you cause to come before our justices 24 principal freeholders of your bailiwick to serve as grand jurors." Next, the crier commanded silence again, as the foreman, a merchant named Robert Watts, was sworn. "You, as foreman of the grand inquest for the body of the city and county of New York, shall well and truly inquire and true presentment make of all such matters and things as shall be given you. In charge of His Majesty's council, your fellows and your own, you shall keep secret. You shall present no man for envy, hatred, or malice, neither shall you leave anyone unpresented for love, fear, favor, affection, or hope of reward. But you shall present things truly, as they come to your knowledge, according to the best of your understanding, so help you God." The grand jury sworn, Phillips cleared his throat again and delivered his charge. "Gentlemen of the grand jury," he began, "the many frights and terrors which the good people of this city have of late been put into by repeated and unusual fires and burning of houses give us too much room to suspect that they did not proceed from mere chance. The court's obligation was to use our utmost diligence to discover the contrivers and perpetrators of such daring undertakings. Arson, Phillips reminded the grand jurors, is felony at common law, and these particular fires were especially atrocious. This crime is of so shocking a nature that if we have any in the city who, having been guilty thereof, should escape, who can say he is safe, or tell where it will end?" Phillips could not have known it, but there would be no more warehouses burned, and no more haystacks torched. The fires were over, but the investigation was just beginning. "My charge, gentlemen," Phillips concluded, "is to present all conspiracies, combinations, and other offenses, from treasons down to trespasses. It would take not days or weeks, but months. And before it was over, the dungeon underneath City Hall would become as crowded and as fouled as the hull of a slave ship." So I hope what you can hear there with my lingering over the details of the building itself and the physical description of these justices and the daily proceedings of the court, the workings of the court, the formulaic speeches that the sheriff would make or that the crier would make, that there is so much that survives in the documentary record to tell us about the Supreme Court and about City Hall. These are buildings and institutions whose every detail has been lovingly preserved by archivists and historians, so that when I go about to write this book, I'm sort of overwhelmed with the amount of sheer detail and evidence at hand to trace out the lives and the point of view of these people like Daniel Horsmandan, the third Supreme Court Justice. So here's the asymmetry. So on the one hand, I have all this incredible set of documents, the building plans of City Hall, for instance, that survive. We have the plans themselves, and diaries of these jurists. On the other hand, the men who are being brought to trial, the men who will be named in this grand jury investigation, these 200 or some black men in New York, almost all that we know about them is their names. There's a list of names at the back of the trial records, and what we know about these guys is names that they were given on the whole by their white owners. So their names don't even really tell us necessarily much about themselves. They tell us much more about their owners. So what I was confronted with was this real asymmetry. How can I write a book that tries to tell both sides of this story and to make these black men who really exist only as a list of names with a column telling you whether they were burned or hanged or sold to the Caribbean? How can I make these men more human? And one of the things I did was to do a lot of research to try to reconstruct the city of New York demographically, to use tax lists and lists of officials who are elected to various city offices, to use lists of the occupations of white men, to use ward divisions and contemporary maps to try to reconstruct the city so that I could say, okay, I do know that this guy Cato was burned at the stake And I can find out that his owner was this guy named John Moore. Well, John Moore, it turns out, lived in the East Ward, and I know that John Moore was an alderman, and I know that John Moore was English. So if I want to talk about Cato, I don't just have to say Cato. I can say Cato, owned by John Moore, and where he lived. I wish that I had, for instance, a portrait of John Moore, though I have a portrait of Daniel Horsman, so I can physically describe the guy. But lacking that, I can at least try, as a writer, to attach some detail to this guy's life, to make him an individual, even if the way I can make him an individual comes a lot of it from what I know about the man who owned him. But the other thing I have for the slaves are their confessions. 80 of these guys confessed to conspiring to burn New York, to kill all the white men, and to marry the white women. So, the problem with these confessions is they sound pretty suspicious on the face of it. And in fact, they're confessions that are coerced. These guys have been imprisoned in the basement of City Hall, in this dungeon. They've been threatened with their lives. They know they're going to be burned at the stake if they insist upon their innocence. And they know exactly the story that they need to tell to get off the hook. And the story that they need to tell, and the story that they all do tell, is pretty similar. And it's a story that's about how they hatched this plot, not in March or in April when the fires were set, but months before, at Christmas time, Christmas of 1740, when they gathered at this tavern owned by a white man named John Hewson at the edge of town. And they all tell the story. This is what their confessions look very startlingly alike, which is what you would expect if they're coerced confessions, because you can imagine the interrogator saying, "And so were you at Hewson's house at Christmas time?" Well, the answer is yes. And so then the confession says he was at Hewson's at Christmas time. The confessions are really corrupt kind of evidence. These black men generally, most of them didn't speak English as a first language, so the confessions are translated, and almost none of them knew how to write. In the original confessions, none of them are signed or written in the handwriting of these guys who are confessing, right? So someone else is translating their words, and then someone else is writing their words down, and then they might, if they testify in any way, sign this document with an X. So from any kind of contemporary legal point of view, from some standard of evidence that we might have in a court of law, these confessions are worthless, absolutely worthless. From a historian's point of view, they're also pretty worthless because they're so coerced. But again, confronted with this asymmetry of evidence, where I know so much about Daniel Horsman and what kind of a wig he wore, and I know so little about Cato, except that his owner was an alderman, well, what am I going to do? So one of the things I did was I started as a writing experiment. And what I did was I took the confessions at face value. I assumed provisionally that the confessions actually all told the truth. And then I combined the confessions with what I had learned about these guys from my demographic research and retold the story of how the plot was hatched. So I'm going to read that passage to you. And let me just say here, as I read this, you'll hear a lot of names again and again and again. Don't try to keep track of these names. What I'm trying to do, if you remember, is make sure to name these people instead of just saying there were 3 guys in the room. I want to give them names. I want to make them as human as the evidence will allow me to. So there's an abundance of naming going on, and it can be confusing. So this is the scene again that the confessions paint of the original conspiracy. Veal, duck, salt pork, a quarter of mutton, 2 loaves of bread, at least 1 goose, a flask of rum, 2 bowls of punch. It was a fine feast. Planks were balanced on low wooden tubs to make benches, and a cloth was laid over 3 tables, pushed together, like cobblestones down a narrow lane. The guests began arriving at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on a bitterly cold Sunday in January 1741. They came from all over the city. Bastian trudged up from Jacobus Vark's bakery on Broad Street. Captain John Marshall's slave Ben headed north on Broadway, and then west to Gerardus Comfort's dock, where he called out to Comfort's slave Jack, "Brother, go to Hewson's." In the Trinity churchyard, Emmanuel, owned by a cordwainer named Thomas Wendover, met Quash, who worked at a brewery on Maiden Lane. And together they walked along the waterside, staring out at the meringue of ice on the Hudson River, to John Hewson's tavern on the edge of the city. It had been a doleful winter, the hard winter it was called, the worst anyone could remember. And the great snow of that hardest of winters had come at Christmas time, 3 feet on a single night, 7 more in the days that followed. "Our streets are filled with confused heaps of snow," the New York Weekly Journal reported on December 22nd. 2 weeks later, a canoe carrying a woman with a child at her breast and 5 men was jammed in with the ice and driven to Coney Island, where its passengers died of the cold. The Hudson was frozen for 30 miles upriver, while in the harbor abandoned ships creaked, their masts rising up from the glacial sea like inverted icicles. Birds and squirrels froze to death. Cows and deer, unable to browse or escape through the depth of the snow, simply starved, their carcasses sinking under the white. Stuck in their city that winter, New Yorkers were marooned on the tip of their tiny island. They'd barely cleared paths to walk down the streets, and there was so much snow, drifts buried dozens of houses, that even sleds and sleighs were dangerous. In the winter of 1740 to 41, 10,000 New Yorkers, 2,000 of them slaves, tried to stop shivering, and they failed. While I'm writing in a warm room by a good fireside, wrote a correspondent for John Peter Zenger's New York Weekly Journal, the ink freezes the pen. As Cato, owned by City Alderman John Moore, trudged to Hewson's that afternoon from his owner's house at Whitehall Slip on the East River, he must have ached for the warmth of the tavern. Cato had come by invitation, but by the time he arrived, there were already 40 to 50 guests in the parlor of what was a suspiciously large house for such a poor cobbler as the Englishman John Hewson. Nearly all of Hewson's guests were men born into bondage in Jamaica, Antigua, or Barbados and traded to New York, or born in Africa, kidnapped or captured in warfare, marched to the Guinea coast, packed in cargo holds, shipped to the Caribbean, and finally sold at auction in New York, at the market on the dock at the base of Wall Street. A few were born slaves on the banks of the Hudson. Now they all felt the chill seep out of their bones as they sat in Hewson's house, listening to the popping and spitting of his fierce fire. Hewson, his wife Sarah, their daughter, and a lodger named Peggy Carey sat at one end of the table. Next to them sat 6 dark-skinned Spanish-speaking sailors, Spanish Negroes they were called, who'd been sold into slavery after being captured by English privateers. Carey, an Irish prostitute, was 7 months pregnant, carrying a child fathered by Caesar, Bastion's owner's son. Hewson's wife Sarah, who had given birth to 10 children, probably nursed a newborn. Ben sat at the head of the table. John O., another of Jacob Varick's slaves, stood in the door a pretty while, but when the meat was served, he came in and took a seat. The other men shifted their weight on the benches, making room, keeping warm. Finding no place for himself, Cato sat at a makeshift side table. The room was so full, Emmanuel said, that several of the Negroes stood. When Bastian entered the crowded tavern, he must have nearly fainted at the sight of the feast. Meat, by God. The slave of a baker, Bastian was better fed than many New Yorkers, but he too felt the hunger that plagued the city's poor that winter, when even bakers ran out of grain. Later, in March, ravenous New Yorkers would taste flesh for the first time in months, when flocks of pigeons darkened the sky and were taken in nets in such plenty as to greatly contribute to the relief of the poor. No one understood why the pigeons arrived so early, migrating from the south 6 weeks sooner than usual, their craws still full of undigested Carolina rice. Nor did anyone wonder for long. Instead, while the birds roasted on the spit, the poor gave thanks for one of the hard winter's few mercies. Before Bastian, his mouth watering, could reach for the veal or the duck or the mutton or pork or goose on John Hewson's table, Caesar pointed a pistol at his chest. Would Bastian join along with them to become their own masters? He demanded. What would he have him join in? Bastian asked. In the plot, Caesar answered, to take the country. At first, Bastian refused. Caesar poured rum down his throat and warned him that he shouldn't go alive out of that house. Finally, Bastian, very much daunted, consented to the plot, to burn the city, kill the white men, and take the white women for their wives. He's but a weak-hearted dog, Caesar called over to Hewson, but set his name down. So what I've tried to do there is to try to restore, even provisionally, even temporarily, in my reader's imagination, some balance between the amount of detail that I can have about something like City Hall and the workings of the Supreme Court and the ordinary daily lives, not to even mention the plot, but just the ordinary daily lives. What did it mean to walk through the city as a black man on a Sunday afternoon when you weren't supposed to leave your master's house? What did it mean to walk through that cold New York winter to find some company in the company of men like yourself? So I just wanted to kind of give you these two benchmarks, really, to think about what it is as a historian and as a writer to try to work with the kinds of sources that survive in the historical record.